Welcome to today's lesson. In this lesson, which is one of 3 parts, we're going to talk about how diuretics can cause hyponatremia. We'll specifically focus on loop diuretics and thiazide diuretics, but before we begin, we should get a basic understanding of how the nephron handles salt and water reabsorption. So what we'll do is we'll draw ourselves a little nephron. Here's the glomerulus. Here's the proximal tubule, the descending, the loop, and the ascending limb of Henle, the distal tubule, and the collecting duct. And in this first part, we'll outline a very simple schema on how the nephron handles salt and water. We'll then use this same schema, or this same cartoon, to discuss how thiazide diuretics and loop diuretics have differing abilities of causing hyponatremia. We're going to label water in blue. So let's just get our legend written here so you can follow along. And that's going to be in blue. And we're going to label salt in red. Alright. What we have here is the cortex above the yellow line, the medulla below the yellow line, and we will label or show the medullary concentrating gradient. Actually, yeah, we'll keep that red, that's okay. And we'll show how the gradient gets increasingly significant as you go deeper and deeper into the kidney. And I hope that becomes evident by the way I'm drawing here. So much more concentrating ability down here than up here, but still greater amount of concentrating ability compared to the cortex. There we go. Alright, so that's our medullary concentrating gradient, and now let's see what happens to salt and water. So, an easier thing might be for us to change what salt looks like so that there's no confusion, since we've already used red before. So let's set this up and let's make this green. Alright, so what happens to salt and water? So the glomerulus is going to allow both salt and water to freely flow across its barrier. And now it's the responsibility of the remaining portions of the nephron to handle this salt and water. The proximal tubule is primarily the place where most of the salt is reabsorbed. So we're going to have almost 85% of salt reabsorbed back into the circulation here at the proximal tubule. So at this point right here, we've got urine that has less salt because it's been reabsorbed and a lot more water. In the body, at this same point along the nephron, we've got more sodium reabsorbed than water. And if we stopped right there, if the remaining portion of the nephron did nothing else but just reabsorb salt and very minimal water, which I'll show as a small blue arrow here, a small blue arrow there, very little water, because there aren't a lot of water channels in the proximal tubule, you have a patient who's salt overloaded, doesn't have the corresponding amount of water. You have a patient who's hypernatremic. And that's not what happens in a normal person. In a normal person, you maintain your sodium concentration, which must mean that as we move along down X into the thin descending loop of Henle, we must have some water being reabsorbed. And in fact, we have a lot of water being reabsorbed. In part because we had sodium reabsorbed, so we have to have a commensurate amount of water coming out, but the biggest reason why water is reabsorbed is because there's a concentration gradient here. And in this concentration gradient, there's so much solutes in the medulla that we're able to pull a lot of water out of the urine. So a lot of this water is pulled out back into the vascular space. So if we looked at our urine at this point right here, we now have reabsorbed much more water than we anticipated because of this significant medullary concentrating gradient that we find. So looking at this point right here, we've got a situation where salt was reabsorbed, much more water was reabsorbed than salt, and as a result, at this level right here, we'd have a patient who would be hyponatremic if nothing else happened along the rest of the nephron. Since that can't be true, since that's not what happens in a normal person, we must have additional sodium being reabsorbed along the remainder of the nephron. And the first place we see that is here. This is your thick ascending loop of Henle. And it's thick because water cannot come across. So we're going to designate that with a very thick white line. So here's your thick ascending loop of Henle, straddling both the cortex and the medulla, and we've got only sodium being reabsorbed. Now some of this sodium is being reabsorbed in the medulla, so it's contributing to this medullary concentrating gradient. That's the red hash marks that you see here. And some of it's not in the medulla, and so it's just being reabsorbed back into the body. There we go. So now we've got more sodium reabsorbed than down at this level here, X. So when we get to this point here, we've got a situation where a lot of water was reabsorbed, a lot more sodium was reabsorbed than at this level here, or at this level here, so we are now approaching the eunatremic state. We are now approaching concentration gradient of of sodium in the blood. That's what we typically normally see, 135 to 145. We've just got some fine-tuning to do, and we'll do that fine-tuning up here in the distal tubule, down here in the collecting duct. So we've got a little bit more sodium that we may want to reabsorb. And we'll get some water reabsorbed with it as well, although we'll get little water because there aren't a lot of water channels here. This is your distal convoluted tubule. And then down here in the collecting duct, we have aquaporin channels that can or may or may not be open depending on how much extra water is required to keep that serum sodium concentration between 135 and 145. What you see here on this screen is a very simplistic cartoon of how sodium and water are reabsorbed at different points to keep the sodium concentration in the blood between this range. And now what we'll do in the next two lessons is look at how loop diuretics and thiazide diuretics exert their effects at different points along the nephron to ultimately cause hyponatremia if they're overdosed. So thank you for watching this lesson. I recommend that you go through it one more time before you move forward into parts 2 and parts 3.